And the federal government cannot run roughshod over the rights and the prerogatives of that sovereign political community. Because to the mind of a states' rights adherent, the states themselves had created the federal government. The federal government was subservient to the states. So, we'll get our heads out of the clouds of political theory here for a little bit and talk about concrete. What does this mean? Well, ultimately, what it means for the South is that they use this as a tool to defend the institution of slavery. They say, the federal government cannot come in and tell a territory that's about to become a state, well, you can have slavery or you can't have slavery. Because that is a sovereign political community, and the people themselves at that particular time have the right to make the decision. Again, this all sounds really pretty, and it's all rooted in deep constitutional theory and good political science and blah, blah, blah. But it runs afoul of some very significant problems that begin to develop in the early 19th century, and it will culminate in what happens here in Kansas during the 1850s. What happens, though, is by 1820, by the time Missouri is about to become a part of the Union, the mood in the country over slavery is beginning to change. For some time, Northerners and Southerners had basically agreed to disagree over slavery. Northerners had said the institution was slowly disappearing throughout the North. Meanwhile, it was tending to grow in the South, and the Northerners said, well, that's fine, we may not like it, but that's the South's business. And the South said, you're right, it is our business, but we're all part of this happy community called the United States. You all aren't threatening us, and we're not threatening you. This man here, though, in 1819, drops a bombshell. Thomas Jefferson calls it a fire bell in the night, which is a better way of explaining it. But this man is named James Tallmadge, and he's a congressman from New York. And he says, and he proposes an amendment on a piece of legislation to create the state of Missouri that says, well, if Missouri becomes a state, slavery must be prohibited within its boundaries. The Southerners say you can't do that. You can't tell a sovereign political community how to govern their own internal affairs. But it's what the North says, or what the North doesn't say in some cases, that proves even more interesting. Northerners either say, yes we can, the federal government's supreme. Or they say, well, this is a good thing. Slavery is a moral evil, and it needs to go away. And this man, James Tallmadge, is proposing the first step in that process. And like that, North and South become quite antagonistic. And from this point forward, from the Missouri controversy forward to the Civil War, the mistrust between North and South will only grow. And it grows in no small part because of this dispute over who's going to determine the future of slavery in the American West. And this continues. Over time, though, the abolitionist movement in the North will grow, and it continues to become refined and developed. And even those people who, there's really two varieties of people who are against slavery. There's the abolitionists, and they really don't like it. They want it to end everywhere. They want it to end in the states where it already exists, and they want to prohibit it from expanding to the territories. Anti-slavery individuals are a little less doctrinaire in their belief. They say, well, we definitely need to stop its expansion, but we really can't touch it in the states where it already exists. After the Missouri controversy, though, it seems, at least to Southerners, that something has been lost in this relationship between the people and the states and the federal government. Because now you have a group of people in the North who are saying, in essence, yes, the federal government can determine where slavery may or may not go. And you have people in the South saying, that's a direct threat to our way of life, into an institution that we support, and we won't go there. That's wrong. So this continues throughout the course of the 19th century. And one of the things that I have found too is that some historians have said, well, this sort of ebbs and flows, and that there are times where the slavery issue just isn't important. Well, depending on how you look at it, I can see how you can say that. But the fact of the matter is, and one thing I found as I was doing the research on this project, is that any time a territory wanted to become a state, or any time the United States wanted to add more land, more territory to its domain, the slavery issue came up. And in the rapidly expanding republic that was the United States in the early 19th century, that meant that this issue was coming up all the time. And people kept putting it off essentially to the future. Well, fast forward from this time, from the time of the Missouri Compromise, up to 1846. And in 1846, when all of that intrigue is going on about what's going to happen with Mexico, what's going to happen with the Mexican War, and what sort of land are we going to gain from Mexico, this man enters the picture. His name's David Wilmot, and he's a congressman from Pennsylvania. And David Wilmot rings his own fire bell in the night, so to speak, in words that mimicked what James Talmadge had written in 1819. He says, well, essentially, if we're going to gain territory from Mexico as a part of this war, that's fine. But slavery must never exist there. Slavery must never exist there. And the issue is reignited and will not die down in the 14 years between when he makes his Wilmot Proviso, as it's called, in 1861, 1861, when the secession crisis occurs and the Civil War begins. The Wilmot Proviso, though, proves just how big an issue slavery had become in American politics, and how when the slavery issue came up, when the North and South were arguing over where slavery would or would not exist in the West, all other issues died away. For a generation before 1846, politicians had been debating a whole host of issues, a lot of economic issues, some social issues, and trying to deal with the rapid growth of the American Republic. By 1846, those issues start to disappear, and slavery fills the void because North and South cannot agree over slavery in the West. The other thing that happens too, and for those of us who read the news a lot today and are accustomed to how dirty party politics can be, let me just tell you it's not much different in the 19th century from what it is today. Party politics gets involved in this. And in the 1840s, there were two political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, and they were both arguing back and forth over all of these economic and social issues that I had mentioned. They start arguing over the slavery issue too. But the slavery issue will eventually bring the downfall of those political parties, because after 1846, after the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso, and after this issue of the extension of slavery becomes so important, keen observers realize something, and you can look at a map and see it. When key issues come up for a vote in Congress that involve slavery in the territories, there aren't the normal splits, yay versus nay between the Democrats and the Whigs. Things aren't splitting among the parties. They're splitting among the sections. You have the North voting anti-slavery. You have the South voting pro-slavery. And that disrupts the political system. And in no small part that's caused because people can't agree over this issue of slavery in the Western territories. The future of slavery is consuming the present. And this continues into the late 1840s and into the early 1850s. And this is the point where those Northern Democrats that I spoke about earlier begin to reinvigorate the idea of popular sovereignty. So let's get rid of this idea, let's get it out of Congress, and let's let the people decide. And of course, we come back then to that old question, who are the people? Well, this all culminates in what was called the Compromise of 1850, when basically Congress takes the map and carves up the rest of the American territorial domain and says, okay, out here in what will become Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory, we will allow the people within these territories to determine whether they want slavery or whether they would prefer to prohibit it. California, which was the other part of the land that America would gain from Mexico in the Mexican War, California is declared to be a free state. That really ticks off the Southerners, but they have to live with it. But you see a line drawn here, if you look at the shading, a line between slave states and free states that is becoming more and more rigid. But the part that I became interested in was this, of course, this idea of how popular sovereignty was going to work out in the Mexican cession. And it really didn't work because people could not decide how it would operate. Who gets to vote whether a territory will be slave or free? When do they get to vote? These Northern Democrats, these men who had proposed this idea and said, let's bring back this idea of slavery or of popular sovereignty and settle this problem once and for all, they were kind of coy about how to deal with this issue. They said, well, when they were talking to a northern audience, they said, well, we're going to let the people out here in the territories vote as soon as they want to, whenever they want to, over whether to ban slavery or not. And they kind